Don't say another word, Olivia. Just keep your hands still. The order was not loud, not dramatic, just controlled enough to make the entire room feel smaller. Olivia Harper stood in the doorway of the private dining room with her phone still warm in her palm and her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. The restaurant was all polished brass, dim amber light, and expensive glassware catching reflections from the chandeliers above, but none of that softened the tension waiting at the table. Ethan Vale had asked her to come here after work. No details, no explanation. Only that same old tone he used when he expected her to obey and be grateful for the chance. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country below. And if you believe dignity is the strongest revenge, hit like and subscribe. Now, back to her story. She had spent the last 20 minutes in the restroom staring at herself in the mirror, pressing both hands flat against the marble sink while she tried to steady the tremor in her fingers. Her blouse was simple, cream-colored, the sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hair pulled back with careful precision. Nothing flashy, nothing that begged to be noticed. That was the point. Quiet energy, her sister had once called it. Not weakness, not surrender, just a kind of strength that didn't waste itself proving anything to people committed to misunderstanding her. Ethan sat at the far end of the table in a charcoal suit, one ankle crossed over the other, a half-smile already forming as if he had been waiting for her to arrive so he could begin the performance. Beside him sat 3 other people from the office, all of them with that polite, curious look that meant they were ready to watch and pretend they weren't. Olivia felt the old instinct rise in her chest, the one that told her to apologize first, to make herself smaller, to smooth over the awkwardness before it could become a scene. Years ago, she would have done exactly that. Years ago, she would have laughed when he corrected her in public, lowered her eyes when he dismissed her ideas, swallowed the sting, and told herself it was easier that way. But tonight she only stepped forward, set her phone on the table, and took the empty chair across from him. No rush, no visible fear. Ethan leaned back, studying her with that familiar expression, equal parts irritation and satisfaction, as if he expected her to crack under the pressure of being seen. "You're late," he said, glancing at the others like he was inviting them into the joke. Olivia folded her hands in her lap. Her pulse was still racing, but her voice came out steady. "I'm here." Just 2 words, soft as silk, sharp as glass. Ethan's smile thinned. He had not expected that. Across the room, a waiter passed between the tables, the soft clink of silverware briefly filling the silence. Olivia looked at her reflection in the dark window beyond the glass, at the woman standing there with her shoulders straight and her expression unreadable, and for the first time in a long time, she did not look like someone waiting to be rescued. She looked like someone who had already begun. Before Olivia could answer the quiet order hanging between them, Ethan gave a short, humorless laugh and reached for the water glass at his side, rotating it slowly between his fingers as if he owned the room and everyone in it. The others at the table stayed still, watching with the careful silence people used around a fire they did not want to name. Olivia could feel every pair of eyes drifting toward her, measuring, waiting for a stumble, a tremble, a crack in her voice. Instead, she rested both hands in her lap, fingertips touching lightly, and let the tremor inside her stay hidden where it belonged. The old version of her would have explained herself too quickly, apologized too much, and tried to soften the edge of his mood with a smile. That woman had once believed that if she stayed gentle enough, she could keep anger from turning on her. But gentleness had not protected her then, and it would not save her now. So she only lifted her chin a fraction and listened. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on the table, the polished light catching the hard line of his jaw. "You always did have a talent for making simple things complicated," he said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear if they were paying attention. His tone carried that familiar, polished cruelty, the kind that sounded almost reasonable to people who had never been the target of it. "But I suppose that is what happens when someone spends too long pretending to belong." The words landed cleanly, not because they were new, but because they were old enough to know exactly where to hurt. Olivia did not flinch. She looked at him for one steady second, then at the untouched bread basket between them, then back to his face. "That is one way to say it," she replied. Her voice was calm, measured, almost gentle. It made Ethan blink. Around them, A fork set softly against a plate. Somewhere near the bar, low music drifted through the room, smooth and expensive, a soundtrack to a conversation that was beginning to tilt. Ethan tried again, this time with a sharper edge. "You have gotten quiet," he said. "I guess fear does that." He watched her closely, clearly expecting the old reaction, the defensive rush, the breathless attempt to prove herself. But Olivia simply reached for her glass of sparkling water and took one slow sip. The cold caught at her throat, grounding her. She set the glass down with care. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe I am tired." The answer was so simple that it disarmed more than any argument could have. Ethan's mouth tightened. He had wanted a scene. He had wanted her voice to rise, her hands to shake, her face to give her away. Instead, she gave him nothing he could use. And in that small refusal, something shifted. Not enough for anyone else to name it yet, but enough for Olivia to feel the difference in the air. The room had not changed, not really. The chandeliers still burned overhead, the linen still lay crisp against the table, and the city lights still glittered beyond the windows. But Olivia was no longer shrinking inside that light. She sat inside it with her spine straight, her silence intact, and the terrible, fragile knowledge that this was only the beginning. Olivia did not move when Ethan leaned back in his chair and gave that same amused look he had once used to make her feel small. Around the table, silverware rested untouched against white linen, and the low murmur of the room seemed to thin into a careful silence, as if everyone could sense a crack forming somewhere beneath the polished surface. Ethan reached for his wine again, slow and deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. "You always do this," he said, his voice smooth enough to sound reasonable. "You get quiet when you know you have nothing to say." A few heads turned. Someone at the far end of the table lowered their gaze into a napkin. Olivia kept her hands folded in her lap, where no one could see the faint tremor she was refusing to obey. Her pulse was still too loud inside her body, a hard little drumbeat she could not silence. But she had learned something in the months since her life had split cleanly down the middle. Fear could stay. Fear could shake. It did not have to speak for her. She lifted her eyes to him, not quickly, not defiantly, just steadily, like someone setting a glass down on a table before it could spill. "I am listening," she said. The words were quiet, almost gentle. That was what made them land. Ethan's smile thinned by a fraction. He had expected frustration, maybe tears, maybe one sharp sentence he could turn into a joke for the others to enjoy. Instead, he got stillness. He got a woman who looked composed enough to make his own voice sound too loud. The woman beside him, all polished hair and practiced attention, glanced at Ethan, then at Olivia, as though searching for the shape of the old story and not finding it where she expected. Across the room, a server moved in and out between candlelit tables, the soft clink of glassware blending with the city noise beyond the windows. Olivia noticed the details the way she always did when she was trying not to be pulled under. The cool weight of the chair beneath her, the faint citrus scent from the flowers at the center of the table, the smooth edge of the napkin under her fingertips. Small things. Anchors. Ethan set his glass down with a little more force than necessary. "Still pretending to be calm?" he asked. That is new. It was the sort of line he used to throw at her when he wanted her to doubt herself in front of other people. Once, it would have worked. Once, she would have rushed to explain, to soften, to make him comfortable at the expense of her own dignity. Not anymore. Olivia let a pause settle between them long enough for the room to notice it. Then she said, "No, just tired of performing for your comfort." The sentence was simple, but it moved through the table like a change in temperature. Ethan looked almost offended by the fact that she had spoken without apology. One of the men near the window gave the smallest cough, the kind people used when they did not want to look directly at a mistake. Olivia felt her own breath steady by degrees. She could still feel the old fear under her skin, yes. It was there, hot and familiar, a memory of all the times she had been cornered into silence and called weak for it. But now the silence belonged to her. It was chosen. It was clean. Ethan's eyes narrowed, and Olivia saw the first real flicker of uncertainty pass behind them. He had built too much of himself around her shrinking. He had counted on it. He had mistaken restraint for surrender. Across from her, the woman reached for her napkin and folded it once, neatly, perhaps sensing that the balance in the room had shifted in a way she did not yet understand. Olivia took another slow sip of water, then set the glass down with perfect care. Her hand was still not perfectly steady, but no one would have known unless they were looking for weakness, and Ethan was looking too hard to see strength. The chandelier light overhead caught on the rim of her glass and flashed once, clean and bright, like a signal no one had been invited to notice. Olivia sat beneath it with her shoulders relaxed, her expression unreadable, and the knowledge that the next time Ethan tried to provoke her, he would not find the frightened woman he remembered. He would find someone else entirely, someone learning how to stand in the middle of her own fear and let it pass through without taking her with it. The apartment was quieter after the dinner than it had been before it, but not peaceful. The kind of quiet that remained in the walls after tension had passed through left behind a thin, electric residue, as if the whole room still remembered the shape of Ethan's voice. Olivia stood near the bedroom window with the city spread out below her, 1,000 lights glittering against the dark like they had no idea how close she had come to breaking under one careless smile, one sharp remark, one look meant to reduce her to the woman she used to be. She unbuttoned the cuff of her blouse with careful fingers, then folded the sleeve back into place, smoothing the fabric over her wrist until the movement itself felt like a kind of grounding. In the mirror, she looked composed enough to fool anyone passing by. Only her breathing betrayed her, a little too measured, a little too deep, as if she were teaching her body how to stay with her instead of running ahead into fear. On the bed lay the navy dress she had chosen for the evening, simple but elegant, its clean lines catching the lamplight with a quiet confidence that felt almost borrowed at first. She touched the shoulder seam, then let her hand fall away. No jewelry beyond a small pair of earrings. No dramatic colors. No armor that could be mistaken for a performance. Just enough to enter the room without apologizing for being there. Behind her, the sound of water shut off in the bathroom. A moment later, Ethan emerged, adjusting the watch at his wrist with the restless precision of a man who believed control belonged to him by default. His expression had already returned to something almost casual, but Olivia could still feel the faint pressure of his attention, as if he were waiting for a crack to appear in her face, a flinch, a stammer, anything he could use to prove that he still understood where she was weak. "You are very quiet tonight," he said, like it was a criticism, like silence was something he had a right to tax. Olivia kept her eyes on the window for one beat longer, then turned toward him with the same calm she had been building all evening, a calm so deliberate it almost looked effortless. "So are you," she said. Not sharp, not defensive, just steady. Ethan's mouth twitched, the smallest sign that he had not expected resistance to arrive dressed so calmly. He glanced at the dress on the bed, then back at her face, trying to read what had changed and finding nothing he could easily name. That seemed to irritate him more than open defiance would have. Men like Ethan knew how to fight heat, how to feed off raised voices, fast tears, and visible panic. What unsettled them was composure. What made them uncertain was a woman who did not rush to fill the air he had tried to dominate. Olivia reached for the dress and lifted it from the bed, holding it against herself for a second in the mirror. The fabric framed her without asking permission. She drew in one slow breath, then set it back down and turned to face him fully. "I am going to get dressed," she said, "and then I am going downstairs." It was not a request, and it was not a challenge. It was a decision. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, as if he were searching for the old version of Olivia in the space where the new one now stood. But the woman in front of him did not lower her gaze. She did not fold herself smaller. She did not offer an explanation or an apology for the shape of her own resolve. Somewhere below them, a door closed in the hallway, and the building settled into its expensive night sounds, softened footsteps, distant elevator hum, the low hush of a city that never really slept. Olivia sat on the edge of the bed and slipped off one shoe, then the other, setting them side by side with quiet precision. Her hands still trembled faintly, but she placed them in her lap before anyone could notice. She would not let fear drive the evening anymore. Not tonight. Not when she could feel, deep under the shaking, something stronger beginning to rise. Not confidence, not yet. Something more patient. Something quieter. The kind of energy that did not need to announce itself because it had already decided to stay. The night had not ended when Olivia woke to the pale blue wash of dawn sliding through the curtains, turning the apartment into something hushed and unfamiliar. For a moment, she stayed still beneath the sheets, listening to the refrigerator hum in the kitchen and the distant first sounds of traffic rising from the street below. Her body remembered the dinner before her mind did. The tightness in her chest, the careful way Ethan had watched her, the strange, steady strength that had answered him from somewhere deeper than fear. She lay there with one hand resting over her stomach, breathing slowly until the tremor in her fingers eased. Then she rose, crossed the bedroom in bare feet, and opened the closet with quiet purpose. She did not choose anything loud. She pulled out a soft cream blouse, tailored trousers, a blazer that fit her shoulders cleanly, and a silk scarf in a muted shade of blue that made her eyes look brighter than they felt. No armor made of shine, no dress made for attention, just clothes that made room for her to stand inside herself without apology. In the bathroom, the mirror held back a woman who still looked tired around the eyes, but no longer broken. Olivia brushed her hair until it fell in smooth, dark waves over one shoulder, then fastened it back with a simple clip. She washed her face, applied a little color to her lips, and studied the result with the kind of seriousness she used to reserve for difficult decisions. Nothing about her appearance shouted for power. That was the point. Quiet could be a form of structure. Quiet could be an edge. By the time she stepped into the kitchen, the sunlight had reached the marble counter, and the city beyond the windows had begun its usual rush, indifferent and alive. She poured coffee into a white mug and stood by the window while steam curled upward between her hands. Somewhere across town, Ethan was probably already awake, already moving through his day with that same practiced confidence that once made her feel invisible. He would expect her to retreat again, to soften, to fold. He would expect the version of Olivia who used to apologize before she spoke. But that woman had not survived the last few months just to return to that shape now. Her phone vibrated once on the counter. A new message. The sender name alone made her pause. A calendar reminder from the law office. A meeting she had almost forgotten because she had been too busy learning how to breathe around her own nerves. 10:30. Midtown. Her hand remained steady as she read it twice, then set the phone down and looked out at the skyline as if it might offer a warning or a blessing. Instead, it only glowed, hard and distant in the morning light. Olivia took one slow sip of coffee. The bitterness grounded her. Not comfort, not peace, just enough clarity to keep moving. She set the mug in the sink, dried her hands on a towel, and reached for her handbag. On the way to the door, she paused at the mirror in the entryway. Her reflection met her there, composed and quiet, with no dramatic transformation to announce. The change was subtler than that. It lived in the set of her jaw, in the steadiness of her shoulders, in the fact that she no longer looked away from herself first. She stepped into her coat, picked up the keys, and locked the apartment behind her. The hallway outside was all polished stone and soft carpet, the kind of expensive silence that made every footstep feel intentional. Olivia walked through it slowly, her heels steady, her breathing measured, her mind already arranging the day ahead like pieces on a board. She knew there would be another test, another moment when Ethan would try to pull her into old patterns with a smile sharpened just enough to wound. He might speak first. He might try to make her small in public. He might look for a crack. But she had begun to understand something important in the dark hours before sunrise. Fear did not disappear all at once. It only lost its authority when she refused to obey it. By the time the elevator doors opened, Olivia had the strange, calm feeling that she was no longer walking toward a place that could destroy her. She was walking toward a place that would reveal her. By noon, Olivia had learned that courage did not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it came dressed in wool and quiet steps, with a scarf tucked neatly at the throat and hands that only trembled when no one was looking. She stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the cuff of her coat with slow precision, watching her own reflection until the face staring back at her looked less like a woman waiting to be heard and more like someone preparing to remain standing. The apartment was still hushed from the night before, the kind of silence that seemed to hold its breath around the edges, but she did not rush to fill it. She chose her clothes carefully, simple lines, deep color, nothing that asked for attention and nothing that begged for forgiveness. That was the point, not to shine for anyone else, not to perform calm, just to wear it. In the kitchen, she poured herself coffee and let the steam warm her face while the city moved in soft traffic sounds beyond the windows. Her phone lay face down on the counter, untouched. She did not need another message from Ethan, another polite sentence with something sharp hidden inside it, another attempt to drag her back into the old version of herself. She could still feel that old instinct in her bones, the one that told her to apologize first, to lower her voice, to make herself smaller so no one would be uncomfortable. But that instinct was not in charge anymore. She had spent too many years living inside other people's tempers, too many meals swallowed in silence, too many mornings rebuilding her dignity from the pieces left behind after someone else's cruelty. Now she was learning a different rhythm, breathing before answering, standing before speaking, refusing to match his chaos with her own. When her reflection caught the light from the window, she noticed how steady her shoulders looked, even if her hands were not fully still. It was enough. She picked up her bag, checked the mirror one last time, and then paused at the door. For a brief moment, fear rose again, familiar and cold, brushing against her ribs like an old hand. But she did not turn around. She opened the door anyway. The hallway outside was polished and quiet, the kind of expensive stillness that made every step feel deliberate. Olivia moved through it with her chin level and her breathing measured, listening to the soft click of her heels against the floor as if each sound were a reminder that she was here by choice. By the time the elevator arrived, she could feel the old dread beginning to loosen, not vanish, only loosen. That was the lesson of quiet energy. It did not erase fear. It simply refused to obey it. And as the door slid open, Olivia stepped forward with a calm face, a shaking heart, and the unmistakable sense that whatever waited for her next would not find the woman it once knew. The restaurant looked calm from the outside, all soft amber light and polished glass. But Olivia felt the pressure of it the moment she stepped through the door. The sound of silverware against plates, the low murmur of expensive conversations, the faint perfume of roses on the tables, everything seemed designed to make a person forget their own breathing. Ethan was already there, seated near the center with the kind of posture that asked to be noticed. He turned when he saw her, and that familiar smile reached his mouth before any warmth reached his eyes. It was not surprise that crossed his face. It was certainty, the certainty that she had come exactly where he wanted her. Olivia kept her hands still at her sides as she approached. Her coat was buttoned neatly, her scarf folded close at her throat, her expression composed in a way that cost her more than anyone in the room could know. Ethan rose slowly, just enough to make a show of manners, then let his gaze sweep over her with deliberate, careless appraisal. "You came," he said, as if she had been invited for his amusement rather than her own dignity. "I was not sure you would have the courage." A few heads turned. A few people listened harder. Olivia did not look at them. She looked at him only long enough to answer. "I am here." Nothing more. Not apology. Not explanation. Not the trembling he had once been able to draw out of her with one raised eyebrow. Ethan's smile sharpened. "That is all you have to say after everything?" he asked, his voice light enough to sound polite, and sharp enough to cut anyway. Olivia set her bag down with measured care, then took the chair across from him without asking permission. "You asked me to come," she said. "I came." The words were simple, but they landed with more weight than anything louder might have. Ethan leaned back as if he were enjoying a game only he understood. "Still pretending to be calm," he said. "I remember when you used to blush at the slightest criticism." The room seemed to grow smaller around that sentence. Olivia felt the old heat rise, that instinctive flinch, that private instinct to make herself smaller before he could do it for her. But she did not move. She placed one hand lightly on the table, fingers relaxed, and let the silence between them stretch long enough to become uncomfortable for him instead of for her. "You remember what you want to remember," she said at last. Her voice was quiet, almost gentle. "That has never been the same thing as the truth." Ethan's eyes narrowed a fraction, the first crack in his ease. Around them, the restaurant kept going. A server passed with a tray of wine glasses. Somewhere nearby, a man laughed too loudly, then stopped when he realized no one was laughing with him. Olivia could feel the attention shifting, subtle as a change in weather. Ethan had expected a scene. He had expected her to defend herself, to raise her voice, to stumble over old wounds until he could point to them like proof. Instead, she sat perfectly still and let his words meet air. You always were good at sounding brave when someone was watching, he said, dropping the sweetness from his tone. But I know what you are underneath. Olivia met his stare and did not blink. Then you should also know, she said, that I am not available for your version of me anymore. The sentence hung there. Clean. Final. It did not make him stop smiling, but it changed the shape of it. Something behind his eyes shifted, a faint irritation, a private offense at being denied access to her fear. That was when Olivia understood it clearly. He had not brought her here to talk. He had brought her here to test whether he could still move her with a glance, still pull her back into the old role where his mood controlled the room and her silence meant defeat. But the silence now was different. It was not surrender. It was restraint. It was her choosing what to give and what to withhold. She lifted her glass, took a slow sip of water, and set it down again with perfect control. Ethan watched her as though he were waiting for the version of her he knew to reappear. She did not. And in the narrow space between one breath and the next, the first real crack in his confidence appeared, because he finally sensed what Olivia had already begun to feel. She was no longer trying to escape his power. She was learning how to let it pass through her without touching who she was becoming. The first thing Olivia noticed was not Ethan, but the room learning to look at him first. Heads angled in his direction. Forks hovered. A waiter paused with a tray of sparkling water and nearly forgot to move. Ethan understood that kind of attention the way some men understood mirrors. He sat in the center of it as if the room had been arranged for his comfort, one hand resting near a folded napkin, the other lifting a glass with deliberate ease. When Olivia approached, he did not stand right away. He let the silence stretch just long enough to remind her of old habits, old power, old wounds that used to obey his timing. Then he rose, smooth and polished, as if he were granting her a favor by acknowledging her presence. His smile appeared first, thin and controlled, the kind that never reached his eyes. You actually came, he said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. The words were not a greeting. They were a small performance. Olivia felt the familiar pull of it, that old instinct to shrink, to explain, to make herself smaller so his discomfort would ease. But the fear inside her only moved through her like weather. It did not own her anymore. She placed her purse on the back of the chair and sat down with care, smoothing her sleeve once before she folded her hands in her lap. You sent the invitation, she said evenly. Ethan gave a soft laugh, the kind that asked the room to laugh with him. I was not sure you would remember how these places work. A few nearby voices lowered. Someone at the next table pretended not to listen and clearly did. Olivia looked at him for a long second without speaking, and that quiet unsettled him more than any argument could have. He leaned back slightly, studying her face as if trying to find the old weakness hidden beneath it. Still hiding behind that calm voice? He asked. It used to be your best trick. Olivia let the insult pass through the air without touching it. The waitress arrived with a bottle of water, and Ethan waved a hand without looking away from her. Put it there. The waitress hesitated. Olivia saw it, the tiny pause, the way a stranger could feel the tension before understanding its shape. Ethan noticed the hesitation too, and his jaw tightened. He had expected the room to move around him the way it always had. He had expected Olivia to flinch, to rush to fill the silence, to make him feel powerful by appearing wounded. Instead, she lifted the glass, thanked the waitress quietly, and took a single sip before setting it down again. Ethan's smile thinned. You are very composed tonight, he said, each word measured, almost too carefully polite. I suppose I should be impressed. Olivia tilted her head. Her pulse was still beating hard beneath her ribs, but her voice stayed level. You do not need to be impressed. It was a small sentence. It landed like a closed door. For the first time since she had walked in, Ethan looked less like a man directing a room and more like a man trying to regain one. He glanced toward a few of the guests nearby, perhaps hoping someone would step in, perhaps hoping for an old ally, an old smirk, an old chorus of agreement. But the room had changed its breathing. People were no longer watching Olivia as if she might break. They were watching Ethan to see what he would do when she did not. He heard it in the quiet. He felt it in the tiny pause between conversations. So he reached for the weapon he knew best, memory. You used to be easier to read, he said. Back when you cared what I thought. Olivia did not answer immediately. She looked at the condensation beading on her water glass, then back at him, her expression calm enough to confuse anyone who had never mistaken silence for weakness. "That was a long time ago," she said. "Not cold, not sharp, just true." And truth, she had learned, could be more disarming than anger. Ethan's fingers tightened once around his glass. The first clean crack in his certainty widened. He had wanted her shaken, apologetic, exposed. Instead, she was giving him very little and somehow taking more than he expected to lose. In that narrow, quiet space between his next insult and her next breath, Olivia felt something settle inside her, steady and unfamiliar. She was no longer bracing for his mood like a storm warning. She was standing in it without asking permission. Olivia reached the private dining room with her pulse steady only because she had decided it would be. The corridor outside was all muted brass sconces and expensive carpet, the kind of polished silence that made every footstep feel borrowed. Inside, Ethan was already seated beneath the warm spill of pendant lights, one of those rooms designed to make power look effortless. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment the conversation around him thinned, as if the room itself had learned to wait for his reaction. Olivia did not rush. She crossed the threshold with her shoulders relaxed, her chin level, her hands still. Quiet energy, not a mask, not a performance, just a choice. Ethan rose halfway, not quite standing, as though he wanted to seem courteous without surrendering an inch of control. His mouth curved in that familiar way that once would have made her stomach tighten. Tonight it only reminded her how carefully he still tried to stage every moment. "You came," he said, his voice smooth enough to sound generous. Olivia set her clutch down beside her chair and took in the table, the glasses, the small white flowers arranged low enough to hide nothing and elevate everything. "You invited me," she said. "I did." He let the words hang there, then glanced at the people nearby, as if he wanted witnesses before he began. "I was not sure you would have the courage." There it was. The same old move, just wrapped in a cleaner suit. A public slight disguised as concern. Olivia looked at him for a beat too long, then sat down with unhurried precision. "You were never very good at knowing what I would do," she said. The sentence was soft, but it landed cleanly. Ethan smiled as if he found that amusing, though his jaw shifted once before he answered. "Maybe that is because you used to make things easy to understand." He lifted his glass, watched her over the rim, and tried again. "Back when you still cared enough to explain yourself." The room seemed to shrink around the remark. A fork paused midair. Someone at the neighboring table went suddenly quiet. Olivia could feel the attention gathering, not like a spotlight, but like a pressure change. Ethan wanted her to blush, to stammer, to look down the way she once had when he reduced her to a version of herself small enough for him to manage. Instead, she folded her hands on the table and met his eyes without flinching. "I do not need to explain myself anymore," she said. "That must be inconvenient for you." For the first time, he did not answer immediately. It was only a second, maybe less, but she saw it. The tiny hesitation, the brief fracture in the image he was trying to hold together. He had expected fear, maybe even regret. He had prepared for weakness. What he got was composure. Around them, the room remained elegant and still, the ice in the glasses catching the light, the flowers unmoving, the low murmur of the restaurant returning in careful waves. Olivia felt something settle deeper in her chest, not triumph exactly, but recognition. This was what her mother had meant when she said the strongest people did not always win by speaking louder. Sometimes they won by refusing to become the thing that wounded them. Ethan tried one more time, his voice lighter now, almost teasing. "You are very different these days." Olivia let a small pause stretch between them, long enough for him to feel it. Then she smiled, not warmly, not cruelly, just with the calm of someone who no longer needed permission to exist. "I am finally myself." And in that quiet, elegant room, with every eye leaning closer, Ethan understood too late that he had not brought her here to be broken. He had brought her here to witness how little power he still had.